Ann Wroth is our next speaker, and her piece is entitled Yesterday I Had the Key. Ann grew up in Portland, Maine, and moved to Arlington after graduating from college. She lives with her partner, who is aptly also named Ann, and they live with their two 17-year-old cats. Mental illness has affected her life in one way or the other for as long as she can remember, and she reports that she is a full-service customer of mental health professionals. She says it's important to put a face on mental illness, her face, our faces, and our spirits, accomplishments, and survival stories. Ann Wroth.
Thanks, Kip. Here I am, all 21st century, coming to you from a hologram. But seriously, this is my story about being in a psychiatric hospital, or 2 or 3, actually. One day, I was at work at a psychiatric hospital outside Leesburg, and by that evening, I was an inpatient at another psychiatric hospital in Falls Church. My doctor and I decided I should go into the hospital that afternoon while I was still at work. I went home, I got some stuff, and I went to my new temporary home. I thought, no big deal, I work in a psychiatric hospital, you know, I'm used to that stuff. And then I got there and it was terrifying. It was terrifying. You lose your sense of self and you develop, slowly but surely, a new sense of self. I discovered. The first night was really long and really hard. Then I got up the next morning. Lesson 1, you might see people you know in the psychiatric hospital. Or booby hatch, as I like to call it. Because once you've been there, you can call it whatever you want. Anyway, I walked into the unit meeting, and there were 2 guys from my first field placement from social work school. They had no idea who I was, but I recognized them immediately and thought, wow, there is truly no difference between these guys, me, and anybody else in this room. This is a true equalizer, like we always say, but now I know. So they didn't recognize me at first. I knew who they were. It took them a while. Finally, one of them stopped me and he said, well, like, aren't you a social worker or something? And I was like, yeah, but, you know, clearly I'm having a problem too, or I wouldn't be here. So it was interesting for them and for me. And one of them did ask me to marry him later, but I said no. I wasn't available. Then lesson number 2. You might run into people from your former life at the psychiatric hospital. So this is what happened to me. Every day we got herded into the elevator and taken down to the dining room for every meal. And I started seeing this woman who looked really familiar. In fact, she was someone from my social work school class, and she was obviously working there. She kind of looked at me one time and then didn't look at me again, and I kept seeing her. So finally I went over to her and I said, hi. How are you doing? And I said, you know, obviously you're doing better than I am because they're paying you to be here and I'm paying you. And she kind of laughed. And I could tell she was a little uncomfortable, but you know what? I didn't really care because I felt like, what the fuck? If you can't walk up to people you know in the middle of being crazy, what right do you have? So that was lesson number 2. Again, you never know who you're going to see in the psychiatric hospital. Eventually, I was discharged, which was harder than it sounds because you kind of get used to being in the hospital and people telling you what to do 24 hours a day. I got used to it again, and I started looking for another psychiatric social work job. And I was on a job interview. I was being shown through the psych unit at the hospital, and walking down the hall, and a door opens, and out comes my roommate from my trip to the booby hatch. And she was obviously having a really hard time. And she stopped me and said, hi. And for a minute I froze, and then I said, hi, how are you doing? And we talked for a minute. And then I saw somebody else from my social work school class. And she said, was working there, and she said, well, how do you know her? And I stopped for a second and thought, and said, oh, from another program. Like, what the hell else was I going to say? And maybe I could have just walked by my old roommate and not said anything, but like, again, What's to be ashamed of? And it would have been so demeaning to her for me not to have stopped. So that's the main thing I learned. There is no difference between those of us who are ill and those of us who are well, and you can be one or the other anytime. I've been in the hospital since that first hospitalization. You never think it's going to happen again. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. You just can't tell, so you have to keep moving forward.